All right, so I left off talking about the reticular spinal tracts and how there were two, one emerging from it's the wrong slide, one emerging from the pons, the other from the medulla. And these seem to have opposite effects on the autonomy of the reflexive control central pattern generators and the basic reflexes that are, as we went over in the previous chapter, that are located within the spinal cord. The pontine one seems to enhance them, or turn them up, and the medullary one seems to reduce them. So we have this give and take control of this, and this seems to essentially turn these on and off. Like, for example, when talked about when the pitcher commits to throw his body forward with the arm to throw the pitch. You can't have those postural stability, or as your book calls them, anti-gravity reflexes active, or they would prevent him from doing something like that. And so you have to reduce the influence of those reflexes at that point. And that seems to be what the medullary reticular formations output is doing. Again, we'll see more about the reticular formation in the next chapter. Okay, so this is the chart that the book is slowly building over this chapter. And so now we've looked at some of these pathways, the lateral pathways, the direct pathway from the motor cortex to the spine for voluntary control of alpha motor neurons. We also have this less important rubrospinal tract, but is more important in other animals, right? It seems that this path has been largely shifted this over here in humans. Of course, then we just talked about these ventromedial pathways. Now I focused on sort of the automatic function of these, for example, the vestibular input to the vestibular nuclei for balance and so forth. But there is, of course, a large input to these deep structures from the cortex. These structures in the brainstem have a large input, right? The largest input, for example, to the superior colliculus is from the motor cortex. And so the output of these is going to be modulated by that motor cortex. But again, this is going to be for adjusting those motions and dealing with novel stimuli quickly in ways that aren't necessarily benefiting directly from the complex motor planning that happened in the motor cortex. And speaking of the motor cortex, of course, we'll return to our diagram of the cortex that we've been working on, right? So in the previous chapters, we look at S1, primary somatosensory cortex, and its subdivisions, areas 1, 2, and 3 there. And then we looked at area 5 and area 7, posterior parietal cortex. Now we're going to jump the central sulcus, which is quite a functional barrier, right? It's one of the few landmarks in the brain, along with the longitudinal fissure. It's really the only sulcus I can think of that is a really substantial, definitive marker of a change in the brain function of that area. But anyway, the central sulcus there, and then we move into area 4, also called M1, also called the primary motor cortex. And then area 6, which is divided into the supplementary motor area, which is on the dorsal or superior part of that, and the premotor area, which is on the ventral or inferior part of area 6. Now, the knowledge that these areas are where the location of motor control in the cortex goes back to the mid-1800s, really. Your book talks about the important contribution of Weil or Penfield to this in the 1930s. He was the first neurosurgeon to stimulate the surface of the brain in an anesthetized patient or at least the patient who had the trepanned area of the skull or the cut area of skin of the skull anesthetized, and stimulate the surface of the brain to try to map functional areas in order to plan a surgery to remove tissue that was causing severe epilepsy, right? So it must have been quite severe for the person to undergo that sort of surgery anytime, even today, but especially back then. And so he was able to confirm sort of this mountain of evidence that had been gathered all the way as even 50 years earlier, and then around the turn of the century with Sherrington, that this portion of the cortex was the location of voluntary motor control. What he found was that stimulating M1 would cause specific motions, and then stimulating anterior that in area 6 would cause more complex motions. So the idea was that you had this primary motor cortex, which seemed to be the kind of direct output to the lower motor neurons. And then you had this area in front of that, in area 6, the supplementary and premotor area that we have come to call them. But cause more complex motions. We now know that's a bit of an oversimplification. Both M1 and area 4 and area 6 have direct outputs to lower motor neurons. It seems to be to different groups of muscles mainly. The supplementary motor area seems to have direct control of the distal motor units or of either alpha motor neurons, so out in the limbs, whereas the premotor area seems to control core muscles or more proximal, closer to the midline motor units via the reticular spinal tract. So, or may be involved in direct control of those reflex pathways. Nevertheless, we find this collection of areas, area 4 and area 6, involved in the direct control of alpha motor neurons, as well as we'll see, outputs to these other areas, which will then go to control alpha motor neurons. Now, there is a motor map, some somatotopic motor map, so not a sensory map, but a motor map, and it's located in each of these areas. This is the one depicted in area 4 in M1 of the primary motor cortex. And we can see its location, and you'll notice it's also, just like we saw with the somatotopic map in somatosensory cortex, not precisely sized based on the body parts that it's innervating. So you can see that there's a huge representation of the face, an enormous representation of the hands, and so forth. And what this is based on is number of motor units. So different muscles that have, as we discussed last time, that have different numbers of motor units can be controlled with different levels of precision. But of course, the more motor units you have, the more alpha motor neurons you have, the more motor neurons in these cortical areas you're going to need to control them. And so even though this is the one that's depicted here, you have these somatotopic motor maps present in both area 4 and in both the SMA and PMA of area 6. So there, look, just as we had multiple somatotopic maps in the somatosensory cortex, we see multiple motor maps here in the motor cortex. So let's review what we've learned so far about these areas of the motor cortex. We have area 4, called the primary motor cortex, or M1. as we'll learn later on, that one, despite the fact that we have direct output, as I discussed earlier, from area 6 to certain motor units, the output from area M1 seems to be the strongest, the densest, the lowest threshold for activation. So even though it's not the kind of confined primary motor cortex in the same way that we have sort of a tightly confined primary somatosensory cortex, it does still play that basic role as the output, the main output, if you will, of the motor cortex to the motor neurons of the spinal cord and brainstem. And then we have area 6, which Penfield saw would, when he stimulated, to create more complex action. So he considered that the higher motor area. And we know that lateral the premotor area provides output to the proximal neurons, and medial in the supplementary motor area provides output to distal neurons, right? So controlling direct control of different regions of alpha motor neurons. And then we also know that all three of these areas have motor maps. Okay, now so we haven't really said anything that's unique or special so far about area 6, but that comes into play when we start to look at how other parts of the brain communicate with these motor control areas, right? So if we look now at the contribution of the parietal cortex and the prefrontal cortex. Now, we can't say too much about the prefrontal cortex, or at least we won't say yet too much about it. This part of the brain, the whole frontal lobe really, is often considered the executive cortex, meaning that it's the controlling part, and particularly controlling behavior. And as we get further out to the prefrontal area, you'll see that the motor planning aspect of this becomes more abstract, and we see kind of behavioral and social behavioral relevant control areas there. Okay, the parietal cortex we've already talked about, that it's synthesizing the sensory world, right? For example, area 5, or the posterior parietal cortex, area 5 has inputs from 3, 2, and 1, which are your somatosensory areas. And then area 7 is going to have input from that dorsal stream visual system, for example, area MT, or the medial temporal cortex, going to have its input there. So we've got somatosensory and visual input here, and then we find an output of this area into area 6. We also have an output of the prefrontal cortex into area 6. So these areas, the premotor and supplementary motor area, seem to be at that junction of the information we would need to plan a motor, or to create a motor plan, and the execution of that motor plan. And we see that motor planning aspect of area 6 in certain experiments like this one that's described in your book. So here you have a monkey, and this monkey is trained to perform an action, a behavior, when he sees a stimulus, right? So he's looking at this group of lights, and he has this light that comes on, and basically it says, get ready to do what you're trained to do. And then another stimulus comes on, and that initiates him to do it, and then he gets a treat, right? That's what monkeys do things for. Now, this monkey, being an experimental animal, has electrodes implanted in PMA in area 6, the premotor area of area 6. And what they found is that certain of these neurons, when the instruction is light comes on, that neuron begins to fire. and then it continues to fire until the movement is initiated, right? So we see evidence that the this neurons in this area not only are evolved in direct control of neurons, as we described earlier, the direct output from area 6 to the alpha motor neurons, or via the reticulospinal tract, but also in this motor planning. So sitting at that interface, input interface between the parietal cortex and the prefrontal cortex, we see this motor plan formed in area 6. And it kind of sets it up as 3 phases here. Ready being the parietal and frontal lobes. That's the instruction stimulus, right? That's a visual stimulus. So the occipital and other areas are going to subtend that, plus the knowledge, the memory of what he's supposed to do, what the monkey's supposed to do. And then set, it would be your trigger stimulus there, initiating that motor plan, and we see that turn on when the instruction stimulus is turned on. Or I should say, let me back up, that the ready would be him recognizing that he's in that situation, which would require all those. The instruction stimulus would be your set, so he's forming that motor plan, and we see those area 6 neurons turn on then. And then go is going to be the direct output from the motor cortex to the alpha motor neurons. Okay. Now another part of go, however, is deciding exactly when the motor plan is going to be activated and which motor plan is activated to cause him to reach out and perform the task that he's supposed to do. Okay. But nevertheless, this provides evidence that we see motor planning as well as direct motor output in this area 6 region that is anterior to the primary motor cortex. Now, another thing that he talks about is mirror neurons, and these are somewhat of a controversial topic in neuroscience because they're really compelling, but we don't really have good evidence that they exist in humans. We kind of can assume they do. And a big deal has been made out of them in terms of learning and development, and perhaps the role they play in learning and development. But again, the evidence for that role is not as strong, and so they tend to be somewhat controversial. But I didn't pull that figure over, but basically it shows that there are neurons in this area 6 that will fire not only when the monkey is planning and doing a known motor task or performing a known motor task, but also when he sees another monkey do it, or to a lesser extent when he sees the same thing done in an unfamiliar fashion. It shows the peanut being picked up. So the site of this activity seems to activate the same motor planning neurons as the actual action of it. So this is reflective of a neuron that is mirroring the behavior of another, even though that behavior is not actually being performed by this individual. And this idea was extended, perhaps, that this is the source of empathy, that's mirror neurons that allow us to understand the behavior and activity of another person. Perhaps this is how we learn to mimic the development of these mirror neurons. But again, this, as I said, that's somewhat controversial. So the last thing I left off here is the subcortical input to area 6 is important in determining when we actually send that go signal out. Okay, and that subcortical input is going to be coming largely from the basal ganglia. This is a set of nuclei. Now they should be called the basal nuclei because these are clusters of cells that are deep within the central nervous system, and ideally we should preserve the word ganglion for a cluster of neurons that is outside the central nervous system. But everyone calls them the basal ganglia. It's kind of stuck, right? So here we can see a region, the basal ganglia, called the striatum because of its appearance, striped appearance. This consists of the caudate nucleus and the putamen. All right, and then we can see the globus pallidus, which has two segments, an external and an internal. Okay, those collectively are called the basal ganglia, but there are other structures that are important in the function of the basal ganglia. You've got a nucleus below the thalamus, the subthalamic nucleus, and then you've got a nucleus in the midbrain called the substantia nigra, black substance, and then you've got the ventrolateral nucleus of the thalamus. Okay, and what this does, here's a view of the basal ganglia. This is just a coronal section. Here's a depiction from a different book of them in 3 dimensions, and you can see the putamen and the caudate nucleus. These holes in it are for the passage of the internal capsule. So the internal capsule axons, as you can see here, kind of go right through that structure. Okay. Now, what the basal ganglia seem to do is form a feedback pathway between themselves and the cortex. Okay, so if we look at the outputs of the cortex to the basal ganglia, we find it is largely from the frontal brain, though we do have outputs from the rest of the brain. So the prefrontal cortex, area 6 and area 4, provide outputs to the basal ganglia. The basal ganglia then provide an input to area 6, the motor planning area. Okay, so the idea is that there's a feedback between the basal ganglia. The basal ganglia kind of get a sense of what sort of motor plans or behavioral plans even are being formed by the cortex. And then depending on how this information flows through, and we'll look at those different ways in a second, we can select from among motor plans that are forming in area 6 and decide when they initiate. Okay, so there's been a lot of study of this circuit in animals and humans, and we have actually a lot of data and good ideas about how this works from studying patients or people where this has gone wrong. Okay, so that's what we're going to look at. We're going to look in detail at the nature of this circuit, and look at some examples of diseases that are caused by problems with this basal ganglia circuit.